Hello, this is Mike Fauché, and living in Southern California, close by to some hills. We were recently on an evacuation notice as a result of these massive forest fires that are taking place in Southern California. This reminded me of how important data can be. So in today's video, I want to talk about disaster prevention and how you protect your data. To find out more about how I protect my data, as well as some options that you can do on your own network, then stick around for the rest of this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, as it really does help support the channel. To kick off 2025, I wanted to go through and regroup not only how I stored my data, but how I protected it. As I mentioned in my recent review of the UNAS Pro 7 Bay NAS, I took the opportunity to do some cleaning up and get rid of some unneeded files, and get my data organized as I migrated everything over to the new NAS. Though we all have our favorite ways of storing stuff, protecting it should be done with a little bit more care and planning. Before I show you what I do, let's talk a little bit about RAID and backup. If you currently have a NAS, then you probably already know that RAID storage on your device is not a backup. If you're planning to buy a NAS unit, then you need to know that RAID only keeps your data intact and accessible so you don't lose any data from a bad drive until it gets replaced. RAID doesn't help if the device gets damaged, fails, or is stolen. For example, if you have a NAS with 3 drives and one of the drives goes bad, you won't lose anything. All you have to do is replace the defective drive. Though you have redundancy from your hardware, it's still only one copy of the data. Should the file get deleted or corrupted, you will lose all the data. At a minimum, you need to consider what's referred to as a 3-2-1 backup strategy. You need 3 copies of your data, 2 to different mediums, and at least 1 copy that's off-site. As long as this process is automated and scheduled, it should shield you against most disasters. As I mentioned in the intro, I was recently on an evac notice in my area for the California fires, as I live close to the hills. However, several years ago, we were actually evacuated for about 3 days, and when it was time to go, I was able to run out of the house with some personal items, my laptop, and my NAS unit. This recent event made me realize how vulnerable we are, so I wanted to share my strategy with you. The next step is to come up with a strategy that won't be cost prohibitive, as cloud storage can be expensive, so it should be used sparingly. The approach I use is more of a layered approach. All the devices in my home don't store any data to the devices itself, but rather data is stored to a central NAS device. Almost any NAS will work for this purpose, but currently I'm using the UNAS Pro. For years I used various QNAP devices with great successes. Use whatever NAS you have or that you're currently using as your main storage. Now that you have all your data in one place, you need to make a second copy of your data to another device, such as either another NAS or an external USB device, such as a TR-004 from QNAP or any other external storage bay that you might have. For my needs, I'm using one of the current NASs I already own. This next step is optional, but since I have another available NAS, I'll be backing up the UNAS Pro to a second NAS as well. Again, this is optional if you don't have the hardware to use. As the UNAS Pro is a new device, support for outside cloud providers is pretty limited. So instead, I'll be using one of the secondary NAS units that I'm using to copy to that runs HBS3, which is their backup program, as the way of taking the most critical data and copying it to a cloud service provider, which for me is Wasabi. Of course, you can use whatever cloud provider you want. I'll put a link to an older video I did on Wasabi if you're interested. They're fairly inexpensive at about $5.99 a month per terabyte. As this is only copying critical data, you're not copying movies and other types of media, the amount of storage that you'll use is pretty small, so it's definitely worth the peace of mind. There are other options, such as putting a secondary NAS in a different location, such as your parents' house or a friend's house, but I'm not going to cover that in this video, but that definitely is an option as well if you don't want to use a cloud service. So adding Wasabi to the mix now gives me really a total of 4 copies. I have a copy on the main storage, which is my UNAS Pro, a copy on the first NAS, a copy on the second NAS, and a subset to Wasabi for a grand total of 4 copies of my critical data and 3 copies of everything else. Again, the second NAS storage box is optional if you don't have the hardware, but for me it was a great way to go. Now let's get into the process itself and how I set up, as well as cover some of the additional steps that I take. Looking at the list of folders, which UniFi calls drives, you'll see icons next to many of these drives. These icons represent drive encryption, snapshots, and if backup is enabled. In addition to my backup strategy, I also enabled the use of snapshots on some of the drives. This can be a really useful tool if something gets corrupted or if you need to change to a previous version, or worse yet, if you get hit with some level of ransomware. Snapshots are your first line of defense and should be turned on folders that contain important data. You can see on mine that I've enabled them on many of my drives. Snapshots are available on most modern-day NAS devices, so if you have it, you should consider using it as it makes things easier to restore to a previous version. Now that we have looked at snapshots, let's take a closer look at the backup process itself. Most NAS units have a backup program you can download from their app store, such as QNAP's HBS3, but programs are available from Synology, Ugreen, and TerraMaster. With UNAS, it's a built-in feature as the UNAS doesn't support apps. Clicking on the settings icon and selecting backup, you get a list of the current backup tasks that I created and the current status as well as the next scheduled run. Clicking on any of these gives you the details such as which drives and folders that are being backed up and the specifics about the location where they're being backed up to. One very important note to remember is if your source folder is encrypted, then make sure your destination folder is also encrypted, otherwise you're going to expose your backup data. Let's quickly go over how I do backup so the rest of the strategy will make sense. Though the devices are used might be different than yours, the concepts will be relatively the same. To create a backup tab is pretty simple. From the backup tab, select Create Task. Give the backup task a name and then select the data that you want to back up. The next part is very important. When you select what you want to back up, look at whether or not the source is encrypted. So in my case, I'll pick only the drives that are encrypted so that I can back them up to an encrypted location. Next, I need to select the destination, which for me is another SMB server as I'm going to be copying to another NAS. I need to add the IP address, username, and password and hit connect. Again, this will vary on your device that you're using. After I hit connect, I need to select the destination folder and then set the schedule that I want to use. As these are changes only, don't hesitate to do dailies as it doesn't duplicate all the data, only what changed. Repeat this and create another set for non-encrypted data. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going a bit overboard and backing up to 2 NAS locations, so on mine you'll see a total of 4 backup sets. Now that we set up all our local backups, the last part is the cloud. To pull this off, I'm going to use QNAP's HBS3 or Hybrid Backup Sync. Use whatever tools you have, but I would suggest a sync type of program and not a traditional backup program which compresses and stores things in a somewhat proprietary format. The main difference is that a sync program will just simply copy the file and not try to compress it. The main reason for this is that if you try and access your data from a different computer, such as a relative or a friend, you'll be able to access the data directly without having to install any type of utilities. To demonstrate, I'll show you how I set up my HBS3 to copy to a Wasabi cloud service. Of course, you can use any cloud service that you want to use. The first step is to actually establish your cloud provider to be a storage location. Going to the bottom, I create a new storage space and select my cloud provider. Follow the screens to get it set up and configured. I won't go through all the steps as there's so many different cloud providers and choices. And of course, it varies on whether or not you're using a Synology or a QNAP or any other type of NAS. Once you've created your storage space, simply go and create a sync job of your critical folders to your cloud provider, which in my case is Wasabi. Of course, if you're using services such as OneDrive or Google Drive, you can set up a couple of these as they're largely free. If you have a cloud space constraint, then you can split up your backups amongst 2 different cloud providers. Though I would recommend using something like Wasabi, Backblaze, or other reliable provider to keep in one location. So regardless of what type of NAS you're using or how you store your data, the main reason for this video was to illustrate the importance that you need an automatic and structured way of making a backup of all your data. There are many different ways to do this, and I chose this way because I feel that's what works best for me. However, there are things like traditional NAS devices, copying to external USB drives, and then copying to a cloud drive. All of these techniques work as long as you ultimately end up with 3 copies of your data on 2 different mediums and at least one of them off-site. If you're interested in seeing how to set up a remote NAS so that you can automatically back up to that remote NAS, then let me know in the comments what you'd like to see, and if there's enough interest, I'll do a dedicated video on the topic. Well, that's about it for today's video, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Stay safe.